First thing I want to talk about is the pulse Doppler radar. This is the type of radar that every aircraft that's currently in pretty much every SAM system that's currently modeled in DCS uses. The way a pulse Doppler radar works is it sends out a burst of energy and it looks for the reflections of that energy coming back to it. If the wavelength of that reflection has been compressed or elongated, that's an indication that something is moving relative to the emitter, and that is how the radar detects targets. So we have ourselves here, and I'm going to quick fire up. Oh shit! I just lost my game album. I'm going to quick fire a bunch of images at you here as soon as I re-upload them. And that's the least useful one. First.
So that illustrates everything right there.
Class dismissed. Okay, here we go. So, lovely, beautiful scene. Summertime in the Caucasus. Here is what that scene looks like to a pulse Doppler radar. The sky is completely empty because there are no returns coming back to it. The terrain is all a flat color, essentially, because it is not moving relative to the emitter. When you have something moving away from the emitter, it elongates the wavelength coming back, and it's called redshift. Essentially increases the size of that in the spectrum of visible light, or radio waves in this case, and it winds up looking something like this. Similarly, if you've got something moving towards the radar, that is going to be blue shifted, and it's going to be something like that. Very easy to distinguish against terrain.
Question.
Shoot.
If your aircraft is moving, even if there's no aircraft out there, but wouldn't that look to the Doppler radar as though the ground is moving towards it? Wouldn't it be a blue shift?
To some mild extent, yes, but just for the purposes of easy illustration, it's designed to filter out that information as it comes. So, when you have something that is neither moving towards or receding from the emitter, you wind up with a hilarious emoji. There we go. You have something like that. Now, in this particular case, this is still going to be very, or relatively easy for the radar to detect, because this is the only item in that empty space that is generating a return. However, if you start incorporating terrain into this as well, all of a sudden it becomes very difficult to distinguish that aircraft from the terrain around it. with the exception of very high altitude scenarios where that aircraft is still going to send that return much sooner than the terrain does. And this is where countermeasures come into play. As far as chaff goes, which is our primary countermeasure against a pulse Doppler radar, it is going to be largely ineffective in a situation where you are still moving at a high rate of speed relative to the emitter. If you are receding directly, you can hope that that chaff packet may potentially prevent those waves from reaching your aircraft, but for the most part, it's going to sit, it's going to hang in the air, and it's still going to be very easy to distinguish where you are relative to the countermeasures you've deployed. Where you start getting into the area where it's effective is when you move into that, it's called the Doppler notch, where you're inside of the gate where the radar is programmed to reject you as clutter, much like the terrain. And then all of a sudden it becomes much more difficult to tell where your aircraft is versus the countermeasures you're deploying. If you do that while you have terrain as your backdrop, that is going to increase the effectiveness that much more.
How do you get, because the terrain isn't behind that aircraft, so the difference between this illustration and the previous one, what is the difference?
The previous one, the aircraft is still receding from the emitter and therefore is still redshifted, whereas this guy is neither approaching or receding from the emitter and is therefore appears as roughly the same color as his chaff packets, for lack of a better term. So, this applies to how to avoid being shot. This is also what the other guy is going to be trying to do when you shoot at him. You'll notice one of the first things the AI tends to do, or any human that's worth his salt, is going to try to put you on that 3-9 line, which is going to make it much more difficult for you to retain a radar lock unless you are in a look-up situation. Sometimes it's fine for you to follow him down. Sometimes that's going to put you at risk and put you inside of potential air defense zone, which is something you always need to kind of take into account when you're dealing with this. But in a purely offensive situation, if that guy starts turning and diving, you need to follow him down at an equal or greater rate and keep him against that sky to have the best chance of retaining your radar lock. The other main thing I want to talk about defensive-wise is IR missiles. IR missiles, quite simply, are looking for a heat source. I know a couple of you are new to planes with afterburners, but there is nothing juicier to that IR seeker than a nice big fat afterburner flying full tilt. Your gut instinct when you see that missile plume is going to be to jam on that throttle and try to get speed up and turn away from the missile, because that is, in theory, away from the thing that's trying to kill you. But what you're doing there is actually making it pretty much an ideal situation for that seeker. Even if you are deploying flares on top of that, you are the flares are never going to generate the same amount of heat as two big-ass jet engines in full afterburner.
Yeah, I know you're looking at me on that one.
So, as far as defending against an IR launch goes, the first thing you're going to want to do, if you have the energy to do so, is reduce that throttle to mill at a minimum. Ideally, if you can get all the way to idle, that's going to be the first step. At that point, then you start turning, depending on where the launch is relative to your aircraft, you want to basically turn in such a way that maximizes the amount of maneuvering that missile needs to do to hit you. Something to keep in mind with respect to that is that the missile is not aiming for your aircraft. The missile is aiming for a point in space out in front of you where your aircraft is going to be at the time that it reaches you. The best way that you can make things difficult for that missile, in addition to deploying the appropriate countermeasures, is to move that point in space as much as possible and force that missile to use its energy to try to maneuver and catch with you. In a head-on short-range situation, the best way you can do this is by performing what's called an orthogonal roll. And Jack has been kind enough to post some really good videos for missile defense. It's specifically geared towards surface-launched missiles, but a lot of the same principles apply. An orthogonal roll is basically you're going to turn your aircraft about 45 to 60 degrees, pull back on the stick a little bit, and start a turn in one direction or the other. And then you're going to roll back in the other direction while maintaining that back stick, which essentially moves your aircraft much like a barrel roll. Not an aileron roll, but a true barrel roll where you're as if moving around the inside of a barrel. What that's doing is taking that little point out in front of your aircraft and moving it in the widest circle you possibly can, which is going to create problems for that missile as it tries to maneuver to catch you. In a situation where you are being shot at from roughly your 3-9 line or farther back, your best option is actually going to be, in a short-range situation, to turn into the missile, which seems counterintuitive to some extent. But by doing so, again, you're moving that point in space way over to the side. Coupled with countermeasures, it tends to be very, very effective. For a 6 o'clock launch, same kind of deal. You're going to want to basically put yourself in the opposite direction from where you are currently traveling. Basically, you want to try to avoid that situation because that is going to be the easiest way for that missile to keep track of your engines if it's looking straight at them in the first place. But same kind of principle. Just try to hide those engines, reduce the temperature of the engines, and hide those exhausts from the missile seeker. With respect to BVR, we have basically a few different goals when we are heading towards the merge with somebody. And it's all kind of... Air-to-air is interesting because the same thing that is the correct thing to do in one situation is this thing that's going to kill you in another one. And it's a lot of just building that ability to recognize which one of those situations that you're in at any point. But the other kind of basic BVR tactic I want to talk about is called cranking. In the Hornet, we have a pretty substantial azimuth on our air-to-air radar. We can look up to 70 degrees off the nose in either direction. This is the largest horizontal window of anything currently modeled in DCS, and it's going to offer us some really nice advantages when we're in a BVR engagement. And we're purely talking one-on-one, head-to-head at this point, because everything else starts getting much more complicated. And it's not something we're going to cover in one evening. But in a pure one-on-one, head-to-head situation, As far as your own missiles go, as well as the other guys, the higher you are, and the greater the closure rate between the two aircraft, the longer legs that missile is going to have. When we're coming to the merge in a purely offensive situation, before that first shot, our objective is to try to increase that closure rate as much as possible. If possible, get a little bit higher than the other guy, not so much that we start to have to worry about terrain like we were talking about earlier, but high enough, again, a little bit of altitude advantage is going to give your missile more energy to work with. Your missile inherits everything about your flight characteristics when you launch it. So it's your job to try to give that missile the most energy you possibly can when you let the first one go. After you've sent that first missile on its merry way, you are no longer as concerned with maintaining that closure rate, and in fact, you often want to reduce it. The U.S. aircraft are at an advantage compared to pretty much everything else out there in the BVR arena. And this is especially true when we start working with AMRAAMs and the active missiles, which we aren't there yet in the Hornet, but soon enough, hopefully. So once we've sent that first missile, our job is stops being to increase that closure rate and give that missile energy to work with, and it just becomes guiding that missile and trying to keep our distance so that we maintain our advantage. Whereas when you start getting in close with the Russian aircraft, you're either pretty much neutral or at a disadvantage. The flanker is very, very good at close-in, low-speed dogfighting. Now that is, the flanker was pretty much designed to counter the Eagle. The Hornet was designed to counter the flanker, so we do have some advantages back in that arena in the Hornet, but still something you want to avoid if at all possible, because keeping that distance is where you are going to have the major advantage. The Russian missiles have a little bit more fuel and a little bit longer burning motors, so they will be able to launch on you a little bit sooner than you're able to launch on them. But the missiles are very, very susceptible to chaff, and they also are very, very draggy. And this is where this cranking maneuver comes into play. Basically, after you send that first missile, you're going to want to turn, not crazy hard such that you start bleeding off a ton of energy, but at a pretty respectable clip enough to maintain your airspeed, and put that enemy off just at the edge of your antenna range. And you're going to want to sit there for a few seconds. What this does is forces his missile that he's fired to plot a new intercept course. Because again, we're talking about that point in space out in front of your aircraft that you've now moved from straight ahead, where the missile just has to basically hang in space and wait for you to fly into it, to way the hell over 70 degrees off in one direction or the other. And let me go dig out my... Here we go. So after you've sat there for a few seconds, that missile is going to have plotted a new intercept course for your new position. If you had kept going straight, as we said, it would just have to sit there. But now that we've made this turn, that missile has to go way out in this different direction to try to meet up with us.
Question.
Shoot.
When you're in a crank, would you maintain the same altitude, or would you vary your altitude to bleed off some more of his missile's energy?
That would depend on what he's doing. The air defense environment, if you are able to descend That is going to be the easiest thing for his missile to do as well, but that'll put you in that favorable look-up situation because you can pretty much assume that he's going to be trying this same thing.
Well, I was thinking more of almost like a roller coaster. You would descend and then ascend, which would cause his missile to have to constantly adapt, which would bleed energy, correct?
Absolutely. Yeah, if the situation permits, that is absolutely a valid approach. The first missile we're going to fire in this one-on-one hypothetical, close to the maximum range that we get that shoot cue at, because this is not necessarily intended to kill the target, but to suppress him and prevent him from being able to keep his nose on us. Because then he would have to worry about flying straight into our missile. As we start to get closer together, after a few seconds, we're going to crank back across and bring him over to the other side. As we bring him through the symbology and center that ASE dot, we're going to send that second missile on its way. And at this point, we'll see in this hypothetical example we have here that first missile doesn't even have enough energy to keep up with us in this first turn. Similarly, our own first missile is kind of running out of steam. But at Armax, you can the missile is designed to let me back up for a second. We'll talk a little bit about what the different little marks mean. Shoot. You just need to maintain that radar lock on the target. The steering dot is only relevant to your launch parameters. Once that missile's off the rail, it doesn't matter. Yep, you just need to have him on the radar, and in fact, keeping him in the HUD, as we were talking about, is going to make his missile have to work less to get to you, which is the opposite of what we want. We want to make that missile work as hard as possible to try to get to us. So let's talk about the symbology on the HUD and on the radar screen in the Hornet. If you guys would be so kind as to pop open your Hornet manuals to page 139. So here's what we're looking at when we have a target locked with the AIM-7. We see a bunch of little triangles coming off of the that circle. We have a little diamond down at the very end. We have an arrow, and we have a dot. The arrow is indicating the target's aspect relative to our aircraft. This is basically the direction he's flying, which gives you a good idea of anything you might need to do in order to maintain that radar lock. If you see him diving and turning away from you, you know that you need to follow him down or potentially lose that lock, assuming that you have the option to do so without putting yourself at risk. If you are in a situation where doing that is going to get you inside of an enemy air defense network, your best bet is probably just to turn around, disengage, and reset the situation. As the target approaches, we will see that inner circle with the inside hash mark start to wind down through the big circle. The first, the big diamond, which we can see is number 6, is Rero, which is the maximum aerodynamic range that missile can fly. You're never going to hit anything there. You will not receive a shoot cue there, but that's just basically an indication of how far that missile could go if you sent it. The first little triangle we have on the outside is called RPI or RMAX. RPI short for Range Probable Intercept. This is the distance where you can fire that first missile, and assuming the target does not change its behavior in terms of your closure rate, its aspect, what it's doing, the missile will have the energy to reach the target. As we mentioned, this is where you'll typically fire in a one-on-one against a target with similar capabilities, just to suppress him so that he can't keep his nose on you. And he has to change what he's doing to keep that missile from reaching him. The next little triangle, referred to as RNE, or Range No Escape in the Hornet, also referred to as RTR at that exact point in space, or Range Turn and Run. As we can see in the description, this is basically the range at which the target can make a 180 9G turn directly away from your aircraft at its current speed, and the missile will still have the energy to intercept its position. The money shot happens in between that and the last little triangle, which is the minimum range the missile can be employed at, and that's referred to as the NEZ, or No Escape Zone. Inside of that range, there is no mathematical way that the target can prevent the missile from intercepting its position. It can still outmaneuver the missile potentially, it can still deploy countermeasures to foil it, but inside of that range, there is no way to prevent the missile from reaching that point in space where the target is. And that's where you start to get to the high probability of kill. When you get inside there, you'll see that shoot cue start to flash. A little outward tick is our maximum gun range, just as a handy visual indication for when you can potentially switch to cannon. But ideally, you're going to be wanting to conclude all of these engagements in between RNE or RTR and RMIN. And that's ideally where we're going to be firing that second Sparrow as we crank back across. In order to give the missile the maximum energy to work with, so it doesn't have to do a ton of maneuvering when it comes off the rail, you want to try to center the ASE dot inside of the ASE circle. ASE short for allowable steering error. As long as the dot is inside of the circle, the missile is inside of valid parameters, but if you can get that thing centered up, you're going to be giving it the most potential to work with, which is always ideal. As we mentioned before, at higher altitudes, you're going to see, and this whole area is referred to as the DLZ, or the Dynamic Launch Zone. You'll see all these little triangles moving around in real time depending on the target aspect, your closure rate, everything that's going on. And we can see our closure rate displayed in that bottom right corner. We see VC, which is our closure velocity, as well as the range to target. If you can get yourself up into the supersonic range, that is also going to give your missile a significant boost in energy, because getting through that sound barrier is costly. If we scroll down to page 141, we can see our radar display, which has a lot of the same information, but just formatted slightly differently. Instead of having the ranging information in the circle, we see a series of horizontal lines across that straight line showing where that target is relative to us. We have our closure rate, and again, the target's range represented by a little caret on the right side of the screen. And pretty much everything else, we will have the missile launch indications on the right side of the screen as well, for those of you that fly the Mirage or the F-15. But in the case of the Hornet, it is only shown on that center line that bisects the target. On the left-hand side of the screen, we see the difference in altitude between us and the target, which we do not see in the HUD, apart from the visual indication of the target box. But if you need to know where he is, it's also displayed on his aircraft, the little bug.
Which number is that?
That's going to be the 22 on the right-hand side of the bug.
Oh, so that's his.
That's his altitude.
Okay.
And his airspeed is on the left-hand side, expressed in Mach.
Well, I noticed when you move the antenna up or down, that caret moves. Now, I'm not talking about a lock. Without a lock, that will move the antenna height. Is that used
correct
for the same thing?
Yep, and that is showing you where that target resides within the vertical limits of the antenna. So that you can, as you were talking about, incorporating vertical maneuvering into that crank, you can make sure that you are keeping that target inside of the vertical limits of your antenna as well. Those two lines we see sticking off of the left side of the screen represent the maximum steering range vertically for the antenna. So we need to keep the target on the screen and keep that caret within those two lines in order to keep our radar in a place where it can maintain the lock on him. And these two, 139 through 142 here, are very good places to hop in and just dig through all that stuff and memorize it as best you can. Because that's all the critical information about what's going on with your target as you're in that engagement. And that's kind of the basics of a 1v1 head-on BVR engagement. Any questions about any of that, or shall we go hop in a plane and run a couple of these things? Alrighty. So we're basically going to go one at a time here. For the first couple, I just want to illustrate where that Doppler notch is. So I'm going to have you, we're not going to shoot at each other the first round. We're just going to go through, and I'm going to have you perform that notch maneuver that we were talking about, and I will let you know when you have dropped off of my radar screen. You'll still see me on your RWR because my radar waves are still hitting your aircraft, but my aircraft is rejecting the returns as terrain clutter at this point, which gives you the edge as far as situational awareness, because you know where I am relative to you, but I don't know where you are any longer. Mr. Gritz, since you are on a time limit here, we can pop in with you first. Yep, you're going to put me on that 3-9 line against terrain. Now, the closer you get to the other aircraft, the less effective this becomes. But once you're anywhere outside of 10 miles, you can pretty reasonably expect to trash a missile lock. And in the case of the Russian aircraft, as soon as that missile, with the notable exception of the MiG-31, as soon as that missile, as soon as I've lost my radar lock, that missile is stupid. It can't, even if I reacquire you, that missile won't resume guidance. All right, you will see F-18 AATRG in the server list at this point.
Now you've got to descend in order to use the